All right, so my name is Amanda Demmer. I'm the program coordinator for Community-Based Research Canada, and I'm the moderator for today's session. Today in our Moving the Dial series, it's our last one before we break from the summer. We have a fantastic presentation on moving the dial on peer support work and escaping the maze, presented by the Supporting Peer Work, or SPW team. My colleague Julia is here to support anyone today. If you have technical difficulties, reach out to Julia, CBRCanada in the chat. If anyone would like to enable closed captioning, you should be able to do that and turn on the transcripts using the control bar on the bottom of your Zoom screen as well. Our presentation today is brought to you by CBRCanada. Our secretariat is located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. At CBR, we are a social enterprise funded by over 50 institutional members, and as part of our programming, we host events like these live discussions. A link to our website will be shared in the chat by Julia, where you can find out more information about us. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, we open each of our e-learning events by reflecting on and amplifying the goals of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. This month, as we discuss peer support work and the value of peer support work, I chose to highlight the call to action, which says, we call upon those who can affect change within the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of Aboriginal healing practices and use them in the treatment of Aboriginal patients in collaboration with Aboriginal healers and elders where requested by Aboriginal patients. So highlighting the importance of peer support work in terms of Indigenous peer and Indigenous ways of knowing and healing as well. We are committed to continual reflection on the interconnections between truth and reconciliation and the various topics we engage in, as well as the various groups of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people we engage in. Very briefly, our agenda today, we will have our webinar presented by our SPW, our Supporting Peer Work team. We'll have some live discussions, an opportunity for us to get in breakout rooms, for everyone to turn their cameras on, unmute, and chat and discuss together. And then we'll have a closing. During the webinar component, while our presenters are presenting, we ask that you do keep yourself muted. If you have any questions for the SPW team during the presentation, you can type them in the chat box at any point throughout the presentation. We will have a question and answer period with the SPW team, and I will be reading any of the questions that have come in through the chat to our team. So feel free to enter them at any time that they pop into your mind, and we'll address them when we get to the question and answer period. My colleague Julia will be sharing in the chat now the agenda for the event today in a Google document, which we will also use later on to note take when we do our live discussions in breakout rooms. So without further ado, I'm very honored to be introducing today's speakers who will be presenting on their peer support work project.
Amanda, you've muted, but I don't know if you meant to.
I'm not sure how that happened. I will pass it off to our peer support team now. Take it away.
Okay, hi everybody. Can you see the screen? Is everybody able to see the screen? Fantastic. Okay, so we're presenting today. Our presentation is called Escaping the Maze, Findings, Recommendations, and Strategies from the Supporting Peer Work, or SPW project. And I'm going to start just by letting you know what SPW is, and then we'll all introduce ourselves. So Supporting Peer Work, SPW, is a community-guided research project funded by a grant from the Canadian government to study the working conditions of peers in low-barrier social service agencies during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. You'll notice there are a few words here that are in bold, and we're going to get to those later. Those are our key terms. We have specific definitions of them. They may be familiar to you, they may not. We're going to share a little bit later how we define these terms. The research is a partnership between George Brown College, Working for Change, and the Toronto Drop-In Network, steered by a committee of experts in community work from lived and living experience. So we have most of our core team here, but not all of our core team. I'm going to introduce myself first, and then I'll turn it over to Andre, and then we'll go in the order that we appear on this slide. And my apologies, I think I didn't implement a change to how we appear on this slide. But I'm going to start. My name is Griffin. I use they and them pronouns. I come to this work as someone with lived and living experience of contact with the psychiatric system. I identify as mad or crazy. I'm also someone who did community organizing around disability justice and peer support work, but is currently a full-time faculty member at George Brown College. And I am the person who holds the responsibility for coordinating all of the research pieces on this project, otherwise called the primary investigator. And I'll turn that over to Andre.
Hi, I'm Andre Hermanstein. I'm a longtime community member. I've been a part of this supporting peer work project since the beginning. And also I am the program coordinator for the HIV self-testing project at CARE.
Hi there, I'm Lindsay Jennings, she, her pronouns. I came to be a part of the steering committee as someone with lived experience of homelessness and substance use and incarceration. And I am currently a research associate with the Tracking Injustice Project, tracking deaths by police using excessive force and deaths in custody. And I also do some transformative justice work with an organization called Rittenhouse here in Toronto. Maddie, I think you're next.
Okay, hi. Can you guys see me?
Yes.
Okay, I can't see myself. Good morning, everyone. My name is Madeline Gold, and I am a member of the Supporting Peer Work Steering Committee. I've given my pronouns are she and her, and I give myself the title of Lived Experience Advisor and a member researcher. I do a lot of special projects, and I'm a person with lived experience in every term except for immigration. Okay, I don't know who's next.
I guess I can go next. Hi guys, my name is Sueda Farah. I am a member of the steering committee and I'm so bad at intros. I've been working in social services for a number of years now. I do have lived experience in a number of different things from addiction, homelessness, things of that nature. And I feel like what brings me to this work is my lived experience. And currently, like I work for various different agencies, doing like drop-in work. I enjoy, honestly, particularly working with people who are struggling with addiction. I think that's sort of where like my passion lies and where like I want to take the work that I'm doing. And yeah, I'm really grateful to be here with you guys. And yeah, Michael, I guess you can go next.
Thanks, Soweto. Yeah, my name is Michael Nurse. My pronouns historically have been he, him, but I'm comfortable also with they. I've worked as a peer, which in essence is working from lived experience for the past 20 years. Actually, I started in 2003. So this year would be 20 years. Yeah. And that lived experience, I think that someone mentioned before, touches on using drugs in illicit ways, drugs that are unregulated, living through the experience of homelessness, through the justice system. So these experiences more or less converge many times. So I've been offering my expertise from those lived experiences in community work for the past 20 years. And I'm excited to be here to share some of that with you. Thanks.
I want to note that our entire team is not here. So we are also very valued members of the community are Dawn Marie Harriet, Julia Walter, and Maria Scotton. And their influence is in all of this work, very much present. But we are the folks who are going to be presenting here today. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with an opening, going to model maybe a little bit of the ways that we open our own meetings. I'm going to take on presenting most of the structuring stuff, so the research findings, how we put our research project together, and then the findings are going to go to members of the steering committee as well as the demands. And then we are going to talk about some next steps, give some space for question and answer. We're really excited to hear who's in the room and what kinds of questions you have. We're particularly interested, I think, to hear if there are folks who are doing research on things that affect our communities here and to speak to researchers. And then we're going to take a really brief break and then go into breakout groups, have some time to report back and hopefully make some commitments collaboratively to how folks will use some of our findings and demands in your own work in your various areas, and then we'll close. Does that make sense to everyone? I'm going to ask for confirmation a few times. Thank you. So just want to make sure, again, everyone is able to see and hear. My hope and presumption is that closed captions are enabled. You know that you're being recorded. To let you know, we've been given the opportunity to review the recording, but of course, before it goes out into the world. But of course, I don't think every member of this community, this temporary community we are here, are going to be able to review the recording. So we're letting you know that if you don't want to be recorded, then save your questions and comments for the breakout room period, because that period won't be recorded. Are there any other access needs in the space right now? So anything that would help you be present and listen to us and talk with each other? Vaughn, go ahead.
Hi, I am Vaughn. I use they, he pronouns. I'm currently working as an undergraduate research assistant with the University of Calgary. I am somebody who is on the spectrum, and it helps me to unmask in online sessions to not have my camera on. So I was wondering if during breakout rooms I could keep my camera off, but be able to engage just through audio.
Thank you so much for being willing to share that. And I would say that there's never any obligation to have to share, and I really appreciate the willingness to share. And I want to assert absolutely no one is ever obligated to have their camera on. I know that it can feel for some people like we're more present, but I want to say, as this is a practice that we engage in the SPW group, also as an educator, a practice that is really close to my heart, is never enforcing cameras on. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you. And it's also good for me to think about for the future to really build that in as proactive, so the folks don't have to. I think that's a basic access measure that that I would like to be able to proactively add to our presentations in the future. So thank you for that. And SPW team, are you comfortable just reminding me to add that in the future, maybe? Great. And Vaughn, I didn't want to cut you off there if you had a response.
Griffin, I will remind you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that being so well received. I appreciate it.
Michael? Is that hand up just to say you'll remind me?
I meant to give you a thumbs up.
Oh, great, amazing. Okay. Any other access needs in the space? So I want to start by talking a little bit about our treaty responsibilities. So the Supporting Peer Work Project works on the occupied territories of the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation. We, as people on this unceded land with different identities and different relationships to ongoing colonization, are accountable to the Dish with One Spoon and the Two-Row Wampum treaties, which are the true laws of this land. We have aspired to be accountable to our treaty responsibilities in everything we do as individuals and a research community. We write a little bit about this in our report and would be happy to talk to you about it more if you want more information. But one way we wanted to start today was that early in our time together, we watched and reflected on the video that I'm about to show. It's about 3 minutes long, which helped us orient to the land that is now called Toronto, which is the place that we do our work. So we hope that it's also helpful for you, and we'll have some questions to think about after we share it.
Ani, bonjour. Sarah Indigenous. Shebenaning and Donjaba, Dakaranto and Day. Takaranto, a Mohawk word, the place in the water where the trees are standing, the place where the fish weirs are. My dog and I spend a lot of time walking. It's my favorite way to move through this city. For me, it's a meditative action that isn't about negotiating bike lanes or public transit, but a time to slow down and really try to see the world around me. Concrete sidewalks, parking lots, now covering the rivers and trails that once flowed freely. The Petun, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Métis, the Mississaugas all made their homes here. And many other nations expanding beyond these groups traveled through for commerce and trade for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I think of the other First Peoples languages and the names they had for this place. I think of the ancient trails covered by the pressures of settlement. The waterways and the moderate climate of the Great Lakes made it a perfect place to fish, hunt, grow food, gather medicines and seeds for horticultural development. Rich, fertile, and abundant, Turtle Island's Mesopotamia. Many First Peoples and their goods traveled from here all the way to the Mississippi and back. Whenever I travel somewhere new, I try to find out whose land I'm on, and I ask, who are the original occupants here? So for Indigenous peoples, land acknowledgements are not only to assert our sovereignty and treaty rights of today, but it's also a way for all peoples to feel more connected to a place. Davenport might be a street now, one I walk down regularly in my neighborhood, but it's not just another thoroughfare. For me, it's an ancient portage trail that holds Indigenous knowledge. They say the animals made the first trails that led them to water, and the people followed. I imagine the deer and the moose once made this trail, followed by the people carrying their birch bark canoes, carrying their goods to trade, and bringing stories to tell. Nations from all over Turtle Island met and traveled through this land. Many languages were spoken. Alliances and decisions were made. People from different nations met and intermarried. The dish with one spoon treaty was made. Takaranto was a meeting place and land made up of sophisticated and cosmopolitan peoples and cultures that I see reflected in the city today. I wonder, is it something in the land and the water? Land acknowledgements might seem like a small and simple gesture, but like many of our ways, they are intended to have more impact and hold more meaning than the words alone. If we pride ourselves on diversity and equality, shouldn't our story include Indigenous peoples? In this era of reconciliation, we need to share the truth first. And reimagine the narrative of this land and this city together.
So thank you for taking your time with this and letting us share this with you. Just going to try to go to the next slide here, which is not happening easily.
Sarah Day.
Apologies, I'm actually going to stop my share for a sec, go to the next slide, and then move on. Funny, I do this all the time, and yet I am having a problem right now. There we go. You just give me one sec. Thank you for taking a moment with me. And I also found that I couldn't respond to the chat while I was sharing. So do you see the screen again? Thank you. Thank you for your patience. So something that we'd like to just ask you to all think about is, whose land are you on? Who are you relative to that land? What are your responsibilities on that land? Are there treaties that you can follow? And how can you be sure that you're living up to those treaty responsibilities, or working against colonialism and all that you do if there are no treaties for you to attend to where you are? We don't have the time to deeply dive into this, but I want to share, and we'll talk a little bit about it more, that this has actually been a central question of our work together. So before we start, I just really briefly want to see if anyone has any things that they would like to put in the space about how we can take care of each other. So we're going to share some really difficult findings, particularly if you're someone who has been brought in to a research project or an agency from your lived and living expertise. This might feel really close to home. And so I wonder, does anyone have any ideas for one or two agreements we can make as you listen to us speak, and then as you speak in breakout groups? So are there any sort of temporary agreements we can come to as a community? What do you need in order to be in this space? And I think ideally, if you could put a couple ideas in the chat, that would be great. And I will add them to this Google Doc I've started. But we don't have too much time. So what would be useful in this space? Ideas? You haven't been given writing privileges for that. So interesting. So so you want trigger warnings. So perhaps what I'll do right now is let you know that this is going to have content about workplace oppression, about lateral violence, so violence between people in positions reserved for people with lived experience. And we're also going to talk about how the built environment and concepts of professionalism come from white supremacy and colonialism. So a great ask, and I hope that that is sufficient. Any other requests, agreements for our temporary community? Anything else anybody needs or wants? Kindness and openness. If we were in a classroom together, I would ask you to really tell me what those things look like and mean, because they can be very different for different people, but we are not in a classroom together. Maybe one more thing we can put, so my hope is that we can all practice this together. Maybe one more thing we can put here. Any other things we want to add to these group agreements? Respect. Again, so I would say like respect, meaning like care for each other's stories, recognition that we might all have different needs. So I wish that we had the time and space to really get specific and unpack these things together. But thank you for putting in place at least a few safer space agreements. We can't make a perfectly safe space, but then you can see them. And when you're in breakout groups, you can talk about them more. So I want to give you a moment to define our key terms. This is from the description of the SPW project. So for us, we define peer work as any social service position reserved for people who share lived and living experiences with the communities they serve, including positions that go by other names like harm reduction worker or outreach worker. We know that peer is a very loaded term and have different opinions on the steering committee about the use of that term. We support all efforts to develop more accurate and empowering language, but at the same time, we needed a term that captured the fact that people with different job titles still face discrimination based on their status as current or former service users. So we chose this word in our research because it captured both shared practices and shared struggles. We are a community-guided research project, and we define that as a strategy for reducing the harms of academic work by making sure that people whose experiences are being researched have control over how their data is collected, analyzed, and used. Ideally, this kind of research turns into action for change, and we're going to talk a bit about that later. And we define a low barrier social service agency as a nonprofit, like a drop-in or community health center that provides survival resources to structurally oppressed people and communities. These organizations are often the most accessible spaces within the broader social service and social work system, but they're still deeply shaped by colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, and ableism. These are big concepts that have material impacts at a whole bunch of levels, and we don't have the space and time to talk to you about how we use these terms, but we have a glossary in our research report, and we talk about them in detail in our research report. We'll give you access to those reports. So for more on how we use these terms and concepts, please see those documents. So I'm going to keep talking here, making sure that everyone is still with me and okay. So we came to the work of this research project, which we undertook collaboratively, with a shared lens. There's no such thing as objective research that is not aligned with something. Funders have expectations. Individuals have lenses and standpoints. We came together recognizing our shared lens, and our shared lens was A, that work from lived and living experience or within your own communities is a transformative and necessary practice that's different from other types of social service. This is an established way of thinking about peer work. We did not feel like we needed to prove the value of peer work. Again, that has been done. If people don't believe in the value of peer work, then we're not here to convince folks of that. We also came here knowing that people in peer positions face exploitation and oppression at nonprofit agencies. Again, if the words and voices and organizing of people in these roles isn't enough, there has been a whole canon of literature that is evidence-based within Eurocentric academic models about this. So we didn't need to reprove this. We also came knowing that because there are so many peer training programs and issues of exploitation and oppression persist, we came together presuming that the problem that peers experience at work is not because peers themselves lack training. Something else is going on. So we also invested really strongly in the practice of community in research. So our primary focus was our relationships as a core team. We have a really wide range of experiences and expertises. People have a lot of diverse forms of wisdom, and we shared an analysis and an investment in really coming to every part of the project together. We also prioritized thinking about the treaties that we were responsible to on this land in how we met, and we made decisions by consensus. We engaged collaboratively in a research project. The research project that we applied for funding for before we came together as a community, it was just myself and a couple other people. We applied for it in 2019 in a world that looked really different than April 2020 when we got our funding. So everything we knew was thrown out the window in terms of how we shape this research. We prioritized the needs, desires, and insights of the peer workers that we spoke to and decided we wanted to speak to more peer workers than people in managerial or supervisory positions. And we compensated all interviewees equitably. Part of this also meant ensuring that people got paid before we started recording. So this is a really crucial practice that so that if someone is coming in for an interview, they get paid when they show up for the interview before they say anything, so that they don't feel that they have to say something specific in order to get money, or that they have to stay for an entire interview if the interview is triggering or not worthwhile for them in order to get compensation. So I'm going to briefly share with you the demographics. We've had a lot of really amazing, interesting conversations as a research team about what it means to collect demographics, when to collect demographics, what kinds of demographics to collect. So these are elements of people's identity. And we want to share with you that we decided to collect parts of people's social locations, but what we're sharing with you today are disaggregated and decontextualized. People live their identities together. People are not one thing. People are not their gender separate from their racial identity, right? Separate from their class identity, et cetera. We live these things together. So what we're sharing here is not people, it's data points, and therefore it is doesn't tell you all that much, but we felt it was important for you to know there's some specific things here that we felt were important to call attention to. So we interviewed 35 people in peer designated positions. Our peer interviewees were relatively racially diverse, so 29% white, 26% Indigenous, 11% Black, and 14% racialized but not Black or Indigenous. This is one of those moments where we couldn't name people's specific identities because we'd be saying we interviewed one person with this specific identity and risk people being identifiable, particularly in a small sector like peer work. But that also means that we've collapsed a bunch of things together. A little over half of our interviewees were cisgender women. The rest were cisgender men and trans, non-binary, or gender diverse people. Again, a moment where we're smushing a bunch of really different identities into an overarching category in order to keep anonymity. 80% were working as peers at the time of the interview. And we explicitly did not ask people about their lived experiences because we were interested in their work experiences, not their lives. But most identified openly as current or former criminalized drug users. Many were or had been unhoused. Several identified as disabled. Some had experience as sex workers, and many had survived incarceration. And then we interviewed 16 people in supervisory or managerial positions. And this is a place where we think it's important for you to know that most of the people in supervisory positions were white, 81% were white, and most were cisgender men in a field, social work, that is actually mostly cisgender women. So we thought that was worth noting. 87% were working in supervisory and or managerial positions over peers at the time. Some openly identified their own lived and or living experience, but did not share any specifics. And this was a point we really wanted to express to you that will come back in the findings. Many, or the sort of idea of it will come back in the findings, many supervisors identified openly as leaders in the field and said that they were champions of peer work, but were also very concerned about being identifiable in the final report. And so would often say things off the record or say, I hope that won't identify me, in ways that people who are asked to constantly disclose their lived experience were not asking for. So things that we thought were important. So I'm going to turn it over to the rest of the steering committee now for the findings. And thanks for listening to me talk so much.
Thank you so much, Griffin. So number one, peers and supervisors define peer work differently. Can everybody hear me? I should have asked that first. Okay, great. Despite saying they support the unique contributions of peers, supervisors think of peer work as a learning opportunity or stepping stone to mainstream employment. Peers see their work very differently. Peers challenge oppressive practices and lead new initiatives. They resist the gatekeeping of social services by cultivating community. For some Indigenous workers, peer work is how they decolonize care. And just a quote from a peer worker, a peer is somebody that is a peer of the community, not a peer of your organization. This is where organizations get confused. Yeah, peers are doing the work, but they're doing it in a way they know the community needs.
Okay, I guess I'm next. Peers work precarious positions, which supervisors claim is unavoidable. The pandemic has increased the risk and intensity of peer work, but not the pay. Almost all peers we spoke to worked underpaid and insecure contract jobs with no benefit. Most supervisors acknowledged this inequity, but said their hands are tied by funders. Others justified low pay as necessary, as so peers could receive social assistance, even though, sorry, my slide got cut off, so I'm just going to make up my own ending. Okay, so even though management has full advocacy to make that change. And a quote from a peer, it's more desperate workforce that's willing to do jobs that many people are not willing to do at lower rates. And that was from a supervisor. Okay, Andre, you're up next.
Yeah, peers face discrimination, which supervisors justify as support. Many peers experience disrespect and scrutiny from non-peers, Black peers facing the highest levels of surveillance and distrust. Most peers are asked intrusive questions about self-care while being denied the resources to meet their actual needs. Many supervisors justify their scrutiny of peers as necessary, suggesting that peers need case management and other types of social work support rather than better pay and better work conditions. One quote is, I'm a harm reduction worker. We were literally hired to give knowledge about substance use, not serve food, not clean toilets. It seems as if we got these jobs that nobody is willing to do, and it just falls on peers.
I think this was Maria's. Should I read it?
Sure.
Okay. The physical spaces of low barrier agencies are unwelcoming or hostile to peers. Peers are often forced to work in basements or on lower floors. They got blocked out of front doors and offices. Black and Indigenous workers reported the greatest barriers to accessing agency space and the most scrutiny in them. Peers are also subjected to more grief, loss, violence at work, and greater exposure to COVID-19 than any other workers. Outreach and offsite workers, especially those at satellite sites, so that's harm reduction spaces run out of people's homes, face the most danger with the least support. And I've got 2 quotes from peer workers here. If I need that money, which I do, I just put up with the risk of getting sick. That's a peer worker. And another peer worker, why am I getting treated like a criminal in my own workspace?
Number 5 is supervisors hold peers to oppressive standards. Supervisors hire peers for their community knowledge, then claim they lack the professionalism to succeed. For many supervisors, professionalism means appearing to not use drugs, being punctual, and not struggling with paperwork. Research shows that these types of professional standards judge a person's access to economic and social stability rather than the quality of their work. They are known to be racist, classist, ableist, and colonial. 2 quotes that we have. The first one is, the organization is predominantly very cis, white, straight, and those are the people that are getting promoted. The second one is, the truth is, if I got paid for what I'm worth, I don't think I would have a problem attending. I'd like to snap after that quote.
Number 6, peers sometimes oppress each other to get ahead. In these working conditions, peers often compete with and police each other to get better work. Workers with more social power sometimes describe themselves as not like other peers and or made negative or insulted comments about their colleagues with more oppressed identities. Black and Indigenous peer workers share the most stories of oppression from their colleagues. Supervisors say that these dynamics between peers made them uncomfortable, but admitted they sometimes played into the hiring process. A quote from a peer worker: the peers stick together as much as they can, but because there's not the pay equity and because there are not a lot of full-time permanent peer jobs, people are stepping on each other to get ahead.
So in summary, and I hope that folks are seeing the depth of analysis that came from our interviewees. We did a lot of work thinking together, but the interviewees in peer positions had a significant depth of analysis. So in summary, while many organizations say they value the contributions of people with lived and living expertise, they force peer workers to follow policies and practices that undermine their unique knowledge and skills. Peers face discrimination, neglect, and double standards that block them from making positive change at their organizations and in their lives. To truly support peer work, organizations must break down the barriers they have built to meaningful and equitable employment. This starts with providing all workers job security and a living wage, but it doesn't end there. Many peers with permanent jobs still experience oppression because of hierarchies in workplace culture and physical spaces. Peers have the potential to forge new paths, but only if they're trusted, respected, and resourced on their own terms. So how do we escape these traps and dead ends? We have some demands.
Sorry, I was muted. Commit to honoring community knowledge. Agencies must take direction from the people whose needs they claim to meet. People with living expertise should be at every organizational level.
Change hiring and onboarding. Peer work should not require credentials. People should be hired for their real abilities, trained in things that matter, like labor rights and paperwork.
Okay, provide meaningful employment. Peer roles must be better paid and more secure. Peers also need collective representation, ideally through a separate union. I'll read the next one as well. Ensure physical access and safety. Peers need access to all agency spaces in safe and meaningful ways and need resources to reduce violence and deal with grief in the workplace.
Confront oppression. Agencies must address how colonialism, white supremacy, anti-Black racism, and all forms of oppression shape their work. This starts by hiring, supporting, and respecting Black and Indigenous peer workers, but does not end there.
Change the culture. Supervisors should know and understand what value peers bring. They must change their practices and give up some of their power.
So we also have provided a resource for people to start doing this work. So this starts with asking tough questions and making commitments once you find out the answers. So to support this, we've created a resource called Questions for Agencies, which includes questions that people, particularly in supervisory, managerial, executive director, board, and funding positions, need to ask themselves about the definition of peer work, their governance structures, their funding decisions, their job postings and hiring, their compensation, job security and benefits, workplace safety and access, and more. So we wanted to give you a little sense of what we're doing with this. So how are we moving the dial? Well, we're working to get our findings, demands, and questions into the hands of peer workers, supervisors, managers, executive directors, board members, and funders. We've started doing presentations like this. And so we think that you also have a role to play in moving the dial. If you're here and you know, then you have a role to play in change. We will absolutely share the resource. We'll share all of our community documents. We have several. And we've been advocating for equitable compensation for our time. So one thing that we have committed to is not reproducing structures of oppression within how we value our own time in these spaces. We're also starting to build networks and programs with our partner agencies, Working for Change and Toronto Drop-In Network, as well as a new partner, Breakaway, supported by the Center for Community-Based Research, who are giving us some coaching and other kinds of support. Our current priorities are building trainings for agency leaders and funders on how to support peers, supporting agencies in evaluating their culture and workplace wellness, challenging prisons and jails to allow survivors of these systems to work with people inside them. One really important demand we have is that no jobs should ever require a police record check, for example, and planting the seeds for a peer worker union, a separate peer worker union. So that's the end of this part of our presentation. I hope that we're okay for time, Amanda and Julia. This is the time that we would take any questions.
So I welcome anyone. I haven't seen any questions come in the chat yet, just lots of supportive messages. But if folks do have questions, here's the chance. You can type your questions in the chat and I'll read them out to the group. If you feel comfortable and you prefer, you may also choose to unmute yourself. You can use the hand raise function in Zoom or share your function that way, or share your question that way using that function as well. And I see my colleague Julia has put a question in the chat to get things started while folks are thinking of what questions they may have. Julia's question is, have organizations used the guide that you've provided? If so, or if not, what feedback have you had about it when you've approached organizations with it?
Does anyone on the steering committee want to sort of help folks understand kind of where we're at with this process?
I'll answer. Our document's pretty new. I mean, that is our hope in the future, but the document's new, so it's still getting out there. So the answer would be, as far as I know, that nobody has probably put it into practice yet, but that's the whole point of making this information available. So for future, everybody pray and hope that yes, it will be used. Was that okay, Griffin?
You tell me.
Okay.
Of course, 100%. I was actually thinking also of, tell me what other folks think about this. One of the main questions we've been having at some of the conversations about next steps is, you know, you can get people to read something, you can get people to go to a training, but how do you actually hold them accountable to like following up? How are you implementing this? Like, where are your additional questions? Like, where are you hitting roadblocks? Where do those roadblocks come from? And that's the thing that we are hoping in having these conversations with folks here and in other places, that we're going to start strategizing together, because it's one thing to share and it's another thing to actually make change.
I see Julia has her hand up, so we can go to Julia first, and then I'll go to the question in the chat from Patsy and then to Vaughn.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello? Hi, okay. First of all, thank you so much, Griffin and the team, for this amazing presentation. I just think it's so relevant and needed to be out there. And I had a question about supervisors and you know, your point on changing the culture. Could you give some examples that you maybe observed, or maybe like more aspirational, how organizations could give up some of their power? What would be this transformative, what would be the examples of such transformative actions of power sharing?
I mean, I can only speak from my personal experiences, but I definitely, I feel that when folks with lived or living experience are coming into an organization and they may have different ideas around how programs should be running, maybe the times of those programs, the setup of the program, and your supervisors or my supervisors didn't agree, they wanted to do it the way that they wanted to do. And then depending on the type of person you are, you can, you know, some people retreat and just go along with it. I was not that type of person. And I challenged my supervisor. You know, I would challenge my manager to change policies and to change the way our setup is. And that ended up just me being punished, right? Like it looks as my manager, my supervisor didn't like that I would challenge. And I don't know, I can't speak to what was going through in their mind, but just because people have different skills and have different expertise doesn't mean that they're a threat to your job, right? And so I think that allowing people with creative ideas to change the way your organization works, or the way that you that people move through that, is super important. I also just think with conflict too, we don't talk much about conflict within our presentation, but conflict happens everywhere with everyone. And so it's not specialized, these incidents at work when you come into conflict, right? That's all about a power dynamic too, is them telling you what you did wrong. You have to say, yes, okay, even though that may not be the case, right? And it's also not, maybe not your experience. And so I think that a change of culture sometimes needs to address personality clashes and individuality and people's beliefs and biases and egos. And so figuring out a way how to support everybody's ego, and, you know, and allow the people that live this way, the reason why you hired them to implement those changes, because those are the experts, they're living it. Anybody else want to jump in? Sorry, there was a little bit of a rant, but that's a big one.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you. I mean, there is no easy answer to this question. I'm very aware of that.
I jump in for a bit.
You go ahead. Oh, Michael's going to go ahead. Okay. Michael and then Suwaida, and then I want to jump in before we move.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, Patsy's question in the chat, if we want to address that after this one, maybe. I just didn't want it to go unnoticed.
I wanted to jump in, and from the last comment, I want to say that there is some ease in responding to the question. I think the slide that talked about collaborative care, the way to the future, I believe that that's a fundamental shift that needs to happen within organizations. That when people working from lived experience and people working from particularly academic training and so begin to work together, that the effort is collaborative. This work cannot really be effective unless it is collaborative. And that collaboration should be grounded in the terms of reference and any kind of guidance documents, because the participation is coming from different experiences. Some people are coming from training, some people are coming from lived experience, and they're different orientations. So until it is recognized that academically trained people or managers are not or should not be in a position to boss people around because they don't agree, or build structures that alienate people because they don't respect their expertise, until that is looked at in a way that says, okay, we all bring value to this work, and it has to be a collaboration in order for us to function fully and realistically. Until that happens, I think that there will always be these challenges. But a way forward for me is to recognize the value of collaboration and build it in to how we do the work, how we structure the work, and how we respect each other doing the work.
Thank you, Michael.
Just as an addition to these brilliant answers, sort of coming off of that, in some ways, like, you know, our work is so much about like culture change, but the reality is also that the material practices of how people are compensated underline a lot of this. So like, if you're not paying someone, if a supervisor is getting paid like a stable, like high salary, and then they are working with someone who they are claiming they're going to take seriously, but they are not compensating them anywhere near equitably, that immediately demonstrates whose work is seen as valuable, whose life is seen as valuable. And then something we found, and you'll find this in our full report, supervisors then say things like, people don't need better pay, they need more emotional stability. They need more, we talked about this a little in our findings, they need more case management, you know, because they might have mental health issues, because they might end up incarcerated. And what people don't seem to clock is that everyone has mental health issues, but only some people are targeted for institutionalization, criminalization, right? And so like this idea that like emotional difficulty, to what Lindsay is saying as well, the idea that conflict, emotional need, emotional difficulty live only in people whose lives are made unlivable by design, right? And that everyone who's got so much less to lose is so unwilling to go back to if a manager was told, hey, we just don't have the funding this year, we don't have the funding to pay your salary, so we're just going to pay you an honoraria for everything that you do, and you got to fight for every hour that you get paid, and you got to have 100 email back and forth for every hour that you get paid. But that's okay, right? There's no way they would say their hands were tied, right? There's no way that they would accept that. And so this is the way in which the material practices and the cultural stuff are like totally inextricable from each other. So that's just my and that's all in the report.
There are so many fantastic parallels between what you were sharing about peer support work and peer researchers, the models of peer researchers and research projects. So just for folks here who work more in research spaces, I think everything we're learning from Griffin and the SPW team here is very applicable to the way we approach research and hiring peer or community researchers on our teams as well.
Can
so
I just jump in there, Amanda, like really quickly, if you're going to bring up the like peer researchers and bringing folks in to as peers with their lived experience, I also think it's important to evaluate even how research teams are bringing peers into that space and that dynamic. And if we're talking about culture shift, there should also be a culture shift within the research, right? And money again is tight. I understand this funding situation. I get it, but I think paying people $40 for an hour for them to like share like whatever intimate parts of their life, and sometimes really horrendous parts of their life, again, we should be challenging the higher ups. You should be challenging within your grant applications. There should be evaluations from the academia. And I say this with confidence just because of my experience moving through research projects, right? And so I understand it's a burden, but we shouldn't always just accept the money that we're being offered, like a quick $5,000 grant to pay people $40 an hour to come up with a little research project, right? So it's also how you're asking folks with lived experience to come in and facilitate focus groups, but like give people some trainings, like teach people how to code, teach people how to analyze, teach people how to do the analysis part, you know, like actually put into your grants about giving the folks that you're bringing in some skills so that they can also continue this work on their own on the side, right? And so just a little push for the research community as well, to start paying people, their interviewees more.
Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you, Michael, for your response to that question as well. To keep things moving, Patsy had a question in the chat, and I believe Sueda, you had wanted to start answering that one. So I'll let you start answering Patsy's question. And just to read it out for folks who may not have access to the chat, Patsy has said, I see peer support worker positions advertised online for Alberta Health Services. It says the preferred qualifications include outreach experience, completion of a recognized peer support training program, previous experience in a healthcare setting or in a human services field outside of a healthcare setting, knowledge of an Indigenous language and culture, knowledge of systemic issues such as poverty and stigma, ongoing participation in the peer support community of practice offered by the Canadian Mental Health Association, post-secondary education applicable to the position, nonviolent crisis intervention training, mental health first aid. So Patsy's question is, aren't these barriers? How are people supposed to have these at the outset? So I'll leave that question with the peer support team, and Sueda, I know you wanted to start answering that.
I mean, I can try answering. I just wanted to acknowledge the question, to be honest, but if anyone else wants to jump in, the only thing I really have to say about this is when I started working in peer support work, none of this was on the criteria for any job that I've ever applied for. And it's becoming very clear to me that as the years go on, as peer support becomes more known and recognized within different agencies, the expectations for peer also seem to raise. And it's kind of crazy because I will be honest, asking a peer support worker, and I'm not trying to generalize, but expecting a peer support worker who has probably had a life filled with a lot of trauma, a lot of, you know, different abuse of any kind, addictions, expecting these people to have a post-secondary education, a lot of them won't. Like who's making up this criteria? It's kind of sad to see this happening. And you know, the completion of a post-secondary degree, that's something that I've never, like, this is all very new. And I think it's something for all of us to be very mindful about and to challenge these ideas and expectations from peers, because this is the death of peer support work. If this is what is being expected of people, it really takes away from the work. It takes away from what peer support is. It causes a lot of confusion. So I'm just really happy that you had that posted over there, because it just really shines the light to how just horrible things are for peers. That's really all I had to say about it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sueda. So just to add, I think that posting like that is a reflection of racism, of oppression. I think it's a setup. I think that like you would have to maybe fudge something in order to get hired, and then as soon as you get hired, they will begin to start investigative measures against you so that they can find ways to get what they need from you and then kick you out when they're done. So that's basically.
Can I just jump in on Andre? I want to like just underline and highlight Andre's really important point here, because I also want to say that as somebody who has lived experience that I can hide because people don't interrogate me about it, because I'm white and I have all these post-secondary degrees, and I talk like I have all these post-secondary degrees. No one has ever asked me if I falsify anything on my resume, right? This is the same about who gets searched. Everybody uses drugs, who gets searched, right? Who gets interrogated, and so this thing that like the sort of the setup, the encouragement to be like, well, if you got to get the job, then you got to say something, you got to falsify something a little bit on your resume, and everybody falsifies on their resumes. Like that is just that is how, not that we should be in a situation where there's all of these gatekeeping mechanisms, but then who is getting scrutinized, right? That will always follow along, as Andrea is saying. I know I don't need to really repeat this, but I got worked up about it. that always will follow on pre-established lines of social oppression, right? So I will not get interrogated because I am white, because I have a PhD, and no one is going to ask me, right? Even if maybe I have, even if maybe I have at any point. And so that is also about the incredible disproportionate risk of the same practice.
I'll just highlight one of the comments in the chat on this topic as well. Alvin had posed a rhetorical question. I always think about what type of peer worker do these requirements filter out or gatekeep from the field? How does this reinforce the idea that some knowledge and lived experiences are more valuable than others? And how does this impact peers accessing service? So thank you for that reflection on this comment as well. To keep moving along, I know we want to have time for the breakout rooms, and I have seen there's more questions coming in the chat. Perhaps we'll have time to talk about those integrated in our breakout discussion. So the last question we'll take before passing it to the SPW team is Vaughn. I know you've had your hand up for a while. I'd love for you to have the chance to ask your question.
Thanks. I guess this isn't so much a question as much as it is just a thank you. My experience, I'm just recently being introduced to being a research assistant within academia, but my experience comes from nonprofit work, where we were supporting youth who were facing systemic barriers from a number of ways. And we were facing issues with our umbrella organization with things like prioritization and the understanding of privilege that you guys are all underlying here so clearly. There just wasn't an understanding that this type of work can't operate based on privileged people's convenience, and how it isn't just going to be on a 9-to-5 schedule and you have to meet people where they're at. And if you're seeking the systemic change that you're claiming that you want to implement, you actually have to abide by those rules and understand where the hierarchy really lies within your own bias and prejudice. And now that I'm entering the academic field, we are currently in the process of developing an EDI and code of conduct policy, hate that phrase, but whatever, within our lab. And it's really interesting to see how within science, even when you're with people who have good intentions and who are really trying to do it the right way, there is still this underlying existence of an inequity of opportunity. There is a lack of diversity. There is a lack of acknowledgement of barriers that people face. Like, as somebody who is low income and an independent first generation university student, there are so many people who take what we do within research for granted and don't treat it with the weight that it really deserves and needs to be recognized with, in order to enact this change. So I think the work that you guys are doing here has a lot of potential to change things. It's just, I hope that your work is actually embodied and taken within structures rather than just being treated like another training policy. It's not just like a first aid course that you can one and done, check it off, it has to be a part of practice. So yeah, that was just my comments and thoughts.
Lindsay, you're talking muted.
Yeah, I'm just going to add on to what you're saying, Vaughn. I think one of the biggest things that I appreciated in our core team is that we slowed things right down. And I think that this culture shift, that's, even collective care, it takes time. Like, you have to slow everything down. You have to put things aside to deal with whatever's happening. And you can't necessarily always be focused on grant applications or the time. Part of what you're talking about, Vaughn, and having a collaborative culture change is really slowing down and listening and understanding everybody's the way that they come to that space and the goals. But we don't have a lot of time. We're not programmed right now to be slow and to slow things down. We jump from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to meeting to client. We just don't. Everything's urgent. And so if we can figure out a way to allow people to slow down, or to create a culture of slowing down, to listen, to understand, and not just to reply, not try to get through a meeting in 1 hour by cramming all this information in and not allowing a question answer period, you know, just giving space, and giving that time can really benefit a lot of spaces.
You just kind of sparked a question in my brain with that follow-up. On your steering committee, do you mind if I ask what your governance structure and decision-making structure is? Like, are you based within collective action consensus model? Are you more like a majority vote? Are there representatives? Like, I just want to know the structure that you guys are taking to this process.
I don't know how to answer that question. So if somebody else, or Griffin.
Tell me, please, anyone else jump in early on, or
I'll
like,
jump in.
Maddie,
I
please,
think-
go ahead, Maddie.
Yeah, we've all been working together for over 2 years. And I think we all have to be in agreement with whatever decisions we're trying to make. And usually we're all on the same page anyways. I don't think we've ever really had a conflict over making important decisions. We work amazing as a team. And I think we all sort of know each other by now. In fact, this is kind of offside, but you know, we also are very, also like our get-togethers can also be very therapeutic. We're all very open with one another and healing and nurturing, and it makes a great team. Was that a good answer, Griffin?
So here's what I'm going to say. One of the interesting things about it coming to me is that we do operate by consensus, and I'm a full-time faculty member at George Brown College, and I have a full-time job with pay, and so I do my work. I don't do all of my work on the working hours of George Brown. I actually do a lot of it, not because the structure of research at institutions is pretty awful, but for the most part, I have an enormous amount of economic security. And so there are things that like I want to say, like, we have operated by consensus. I believe that we have operated by consensus. And there are times when I do things and then come back and I'm like, oh, should I have done that? I don't know. But I am like, I am doing things. But then I think the other thing, and this is maybe back to sort of like Michael and Lindsay's points around collaboration and also around conflict. I actually think one of the ways that we've become the team that we are is through conflict. Like I think about the moment around collecting demographic information. We stopped the research project so that we could have a conversation. Like, we had interviewed 15 people in one way, and then it turned out that myself and the research coordinator, who was in a more central role at the time, had misunderstood. Like, we had been operating with a belief that we had found consensus about something that it turned out we hadn't actually found consensus about. And so we had actually run off and done something that we hadn't had institutional, like we hadn't had a real consensus about. And so we stopped. We had to stop. We had to reapply we had to go through a bunch of meetings and think through things together, and then reapply for REB approval and shift how we were interviewing. And I think that, like, it is so, I have personally, as like the primary investigator, someone with this, like, with the structural power, and compensation in ways that are that disproportionately value my time, even though my level of expertise is much, much lower than everyone else on the team, right? And that is true. That's like I have not been working as a peer. I was a peer in like 2008, and that's the last time I was working in a position that had peer in the title, right? And so what was I going to say here? I don't know. I've lost what I was going to say, but if I am very, as somebody, this is partially about my own lived experience and the level of anxiety that I operate with and the way that anxiety plays out, and also about, I think, structural empowerment by institutions. I could easily have just, like, if I hadn't been stopped by the brilliance of people on this team and been like, slow down, I might have just steamrolled. And I think that to me, that tension is always there, because it was like, but for the incredible knowledge, analysis, brilliance, and wisdom of the rest of the team, did we not replicate some of the stuff that we are opposed to? And I think it's really easy to claim to be opposed to something, but then replicate it. And I think that if you are not working, and this is again, I think to Michael and Lindsay's points specifically, but everyone more generally, if you're not doing something different in the things you have the most control over, which are like your interpersonal relationships and the relationships like right in front of you, then how can you be trusted to make any kind of structural change, right? If you're like, I'm gonna replicate all these models with the people who work underneath me, or who work laterally to me, or who are my friends, or who are whatever, but really I'm committed to the change structurally. My question would be that, what is structural change? What does that mean, right? Anyway, that's what I have to say.
Can I say something else? We have time? Okay. Oh my God, don't lose your train of thought. So, I mean, all of us on the steering committee all have a background as working as a peer. And so we've all had to deal with the struggles. I mean, imagine working somewhere where peers weren't considered staff. What kind of bull, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to say it. What kind of bull crap is that? It's like saying peers weren't human. Like it was just insane to me, because at the end of the day, when they post for a peer position or a community drop-in position, it's the same criteria. They post the ad, we have to send in a resume, we have to get interviewed and accepted for the position. So how anybody in their right mind could think or process that peers aren't staff is beyond me. And yet they're treated that way. I think that was my point. I probably had more to say, but I can't think of what it is. So maybe I'll come back to that comment later. Yeah, so my main thing was to say that we all have experienced really bad situations in previous jobs as peers. So collectively, we want to make things better in the future. And I think that's like super important to how we came across with how we got our information and why we want to make it work.